don't live here anymore, Niam." Landon Colcroft, 43-year-old founder of Colcroft Capital and Build and husband of 9 years, said it the way men say things they have rehearsed, too smoothly, with the kind of calm that only comes from certainty that no one in the room will argue back. He was standing in the entrance hall of Aldercroft House, the stone estate on the edge of the Niagara Escarpment that his family had held for 3 generations. Beside him stood Greta Colcroft, 66-year-old matriarch of the Colcroft family, and the woman who had spent 9 years looking at Niam like a guest who had stayed past her welcome. Greta held a set of house keys in her right hand, Niam's keys, with the particular pleasure of someone who had been waiting a long time to hold them. And at the foot of the staircase, wearing a cream silk blouse and Niam's pearl earrings, stood Reva Dunn, 30-year-old brand strategist and marketing consultant for Colcroft Capital and Build. She was not required to be there. She was there because Landon had brought her, and because Greta had placed her champagne on the side table. Niama had spent 3 months sourcing from an estate sale in Burlington. Niama Page Colcroft, 37-year-old wife of Landon and daughter of the late Rupert Page, stood at the bottom of the front steps with one carry-on suitcase and her coat still buttoned from the November cold. She had not expected dinner to end this way, but some part of her, the part that had been quietly watching, quietly noting, quietly holding the shape of this marriage together while it hollowed itself out from the inside, was not entirely surprised. In Landon's hand was a sealed envelope from a law firm she recognized. He held it toward her without meeting her eyes. "The settlement is straightforward. Don't make it complicated." Greta stepped forward and placed Niama's keys on the hall table, not handing them to her, setting them down like a verdict. "Some women belong at the center of a family," Greta said pleasantly, looking past Niam at Reva. "Others were only ever visiting." Reva touched the collar of her blouse and looked at Niam with the careful expression of a woman, trying not to look too satisfied. "I'm sure this is hard," she said. "I hope you find somewhere comfortable to stay." Naima looked at her husband for a long moment. He looked at the floor. That was the answer. She picked up her suitcase, walked out through the doors of Aldercroft House, and did not look back until she reached the gate. The house was lit behind her, every window glowing. It had always looked kinder from a distance. Her phone buzzed before the gate closed behind her. The caller ID read, "Lise Beaumont, Page Stone Capital." She did not answer yet. She needed to get somewhere dry first. Niama had spent 9 years being quiet in the Colcroft family, and she had mistaken that quiet for peace for far too long. She was the daughter of Rupert Page, the late founder of Page Stone Capital, a private investment and lending institution that had operated in Ontario for nearly 4 decades. Most people who had heard the Page name assumed the firm had been sold after Rupert's death, the way old money often dispersed after the person holding it together was gone. That assumption had suited Nia fine. She had never corrected it. When she married Landon, Rupert's attorneys had prepared a full prenuptial disclosure schedule. It listed Page Stone Trust, the private family trust through which Niam held controlling interest in Page Stone Capital, by name, with asset figures and governance terms laid out across 11 pages. Landon had signed the disclosure laughing, calling it old-fashioned caution, and had not read past the first page. He had signed because he assumed there was nothing in it worth reading. He had been proud of that once, proud of not caring about her money, proud of loving her past it. She had believed him then. Now she stood in a hotel room in downtown Hamilton with a wet coat over the back of a chair, divorce papers spread across a desk, too small for the weight of them, and a voicemail from Lise Beaumont asking her to return the call at her earliest opportunity. Nia read the divorce settlement twice. It was tidy, efficient, and designed to make her disappear. She was to waive all claims to Colcroft Capital. She was to sign a confidentiality agreement. She was not to contact company employees. She was not to request financial records. She was to accept a transitional payment and move quietly into the past tense of Landon's life. And then she reached the clause that stopped her. Wife acknowledges that she holds no direct or indirect interest in any lending institution or financial entity connected to husband's business obligations, and waives all right to review, challenge, or inquire into any records pertaining to such relationships. Niama read it 3 times. Why would they mention it, if they were not afraid of it? She set down the papers and called Maren Locke. Maren Locke, 48-year-old family law and private litigation attorney who had worked alongside Rupert Page's legal team for years, arrived at the hotel in under an hour, carrying a leather folio and an expression that did not ask unnecessary questions. She read the settlement in full. Then she placed one finger directly on the lender clause and said, "This is not a divorce agreement. This is a cover-up with punctuation. Niama sat across from her and opened her secure tablet. The screen showed Pagestone Capital, shareholder portal, end page. Maren went completely still. Does Landon know? She asked. He knows my father founded it, Niama said. He thinks the controlling interest was sold to outside investors years ago. Was it? No, Niama looked at the screen. It was protected from people exactly like him. She explained what Landon had never cared enough to understand. Pagestone Capital was held through Pagestone Trust, established before the marriage, documented in the prenuptial disclosure Landon had signed while laughing. Board filings used her maiden name. Her married name appeared nowhere in the institution's governance records. She had deliberately avoided any direct involvement in decisions touching Colcroft Capital because she was married to its owner, and she wanted that line clean. Not to protect Landon, to protect the integrity of the institution her father had built. Maren listened. Then she said quietly, "What does Pagestone Capital have to do with Colcroft?" Niama called Lise Beaumont. Lise Beaumont, 44-year-old chief risk officer of Pagestone Capital, picked up on the first ring. Her voice was controlled and precise, the way risk officers spoke when numbers had crossed into dangerous territory. She explained that Colcroft Capital and Build had filed 3 emergency renewal requests in 14 months. Each had been supported by partial documentation and promises of updated collateral values that never fully materialized. The most recent renewal application had included a spousal consent form bearing Niama's signature, authorizing the use of marital assets as additional security against the loan package. Niama had never signed it. The room seemed to tilt. She placed one hand flat on the desk. "My name," she said quietly, "on a document I never signed." "That is the concern," Lee said. "We are recommending an independent review. Outside counsel, conflict screen committee. Given the circumstances, we will need you present." After the call, Maren sat back and looked at Niama for a long moment. "He didn't just try to remove you from the house," she said. "He may have tried to put your name inside his debt." The next morning, Maren issued a notice to preserve records. Every Colcroft financial document, every message involving Riva Dunn, every board communication, every marital financial account, all of it was to be held intact. If they deleted anything after receiving the notice, that would become a separate and considerably more serious problem. At the Pagestone offices, Lise convened an independent credit review team alongside Hugo Strand, 55-year-old outside banking counsel retained by Pagestone for high-risk borrower investigations. What they found took less than 2 days to assemble and considerably longer to absorb. Colcroft Capital and Build had pledged the same property, a lakefront cottage near Muskoka, that Greta had valued well above market, twice. Once in the original credit application 18 months ago, once again in the most recent renewal, with a freshly commissioned appraisal showing a value 30% higher than the first. Both appraisals described the same property with different numbers typed into the summary line. Company accounts showed payments coded under business development and client hospitality. The invoices told a different story. An apartment in Yorkville had been leased under Riva Dunn's name and charged to Colcroft's operating account. Designer wardrobe purchases had been categorized as brand campaign expenditures. Private flights to Montreal and Banff had been logged as market research visits. Jewelry, including a pair of pearl earrings that matched the ones Niam had last seen on Riva's ears in the entrance hall of Aldercroft, had been entered as investor gift samples. Maren looked at the pearl earring invoice. She said she was wearing borrowed money. In the hotel room that night, Niama sat alone, the scanned documents after Maren had gone. The payroll gaps were there too. The same gaps she had covered herself, quietly, from personal accounts on 3 separate occasions when Landon had overextended the business and could not bring himself to tell anyone. She had never asked for acknowledgement. She had simply transferred the funds because the people who would have missed their paychecks were not responsible for Landon's decisions, and she could not let them carry the cost of his pride. She sat with those pages for a long time. Then she opened the spousal consent form and studied the signature at the bottom. It was close, very close. The slant was right. The sizing was almost correct. But the cross on the H in her first name moved in the wrong direction, and the loop on the G in Page was too closed, the ink pressure too even. The way signatures looked when someone copied them from a sample rather than wrote them from memory. Her father had taught her that. He had sat beside her in the Pagestone offices before she married anyone and told her that her signature was consent made visible, and that consent had to be given freely, not manufactured quietly and inserted into someone else's paperwork. She looked at the forged version of her name and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what had been done to her. The mediation session was Greta's idea, delivered through Landon's lawyer as a courtesy. Nymph accepted. Landon arrived with Greta beside him, and Riva one step behind, still wearing the pearl earrings, still carrying herself like someone who had already been measured for the rooms she intended to occupy. Felix Drury, 47-year-old chief financial officer of Colcroft Capital and Build, took a seat at the far end of the table and looked like a man who had not slept well in several days. Marin placed the preservation notice on the table first. Then she asked Landon, on the record, whether Nyam had ever contributed personal funds to cover payroll or operational shortfalls at Colcroft. Landon said no. Greta said Nyam had contributed nothing of substance. Riva, who had no legal standing in the room but had been permitted to remain, said she was certain Nyam had been largely uninvolved in any serious company matters. Marin wrote each answer down carefully. Then she asked why the proposed settlement included a clause waiving Nyam's rights in relation to lending institutions. Felix went very still. Landon's lawyer said it was standard language. Marin smiled without warmth. Then you won't object when we request the complete Pagestone Capital loan file during discovery. Landon's palm came down on the table. You are not touching my company's records. Marin looked at him steadily. You already gave us a reason to. Nyama said nothing throughout. She held her father's fountain pen, a plain dark pen Rupert had used for 30 years and left on his desk the morning he died, which she had carried out of Aldercroft House the night she left. And she watched the people across the table begin to understand that they had not called her to this room to receive her agreement. She was not there to agree. The emergency review convened at Pagestone Capital on a Tuesday morning. The boardroom on the 14th floor looked out over Lake Ontario, grey and flat that morning beneath a low November sky. Landon arrived with Felix, Greta, and Riva, who again had no reason to be there and came anyway, because Landon still believed that presence was the same as power. He chose the chair that faced the door, because men like Landon always chose that chair. The door opened. Nyamach walked in wearing a dark wool jacket and carrying nothing but her father's pen. Every Pagestone executive in the room stood. Lise Beaumont said, "Good morning, Miss Page." Landon turned. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that Felix looked away. Greta stared at Nyam as though the floor had shifted under her feet. Riva's hand dropped from Landon's sleeve. Hugo Strand opened the first binder. The review proceeded without theatre, covenant breaches, inflated collateral, duplicate property pledges, loan proceeds directed toward personal expenses connected to a named individual. Riva done. A spousal consent document bearing a signature the institution's independent consultant had assessed as likely simulated, based on pressure patterns, directional inconsistencies, and spacing characteristics that did not match Nyam's authenticated writing samples. Landon said, "This is a personal attack." Nyama said, "These are your documents, Landon. Your numbers, your signatures." She paused. "I came to confirm which one was not mine." Greta looked at her. For the first time in 9 years, Greta Colcroft had nothing to say. Lise read the committee's recommendations. Pagestone Capital would freeze all discretionary credit access pending full independent review. The emergency refinancing request was declined. The questioned document would be referred to outside counsel. Recovery proceedings would begin on pledged collateral where covenant breach was confirmed. Affected co-signatories would be notified as required by law. Landon pushed back from the table. "If you do this, there is no company left." Nyama looked at him across 9 years of covered shortfalls, corrected documents, and vendor calls made on his behalf without being asked. She looked at the man who had handed her a suitcase in the entrance hall and said, "You don't live here anymore." "Then it was already gone," she said. "I was only the reason it lasted this long." She picked up the institutional authorization form, acknowledging that the independent committee could proceed on its own terms, and that Nyama had declared her conflict of interest on the record. She read it through completely. Then she uncapped her father's fountain pen and signed it in her own hand, with the H crossed in the correct direction and the loop on the G open exactly as it had always been. Landon watched her hand. Felix said quietly that he would cooperate fully with the review. Greta told him he was a coward. Felix said he preferred that to the alternative. Colcroft Capital and Build filed for creditor protection within 3 weeks. The collapse was not dramatic from the outside. It rarely was. When the foundation had been borrowed time all along, investors withdrew. A second lender issued a cross-default notice after learning Pagestone had frozen credit and opened a fraud referral. Vendors stopped extending terms. Payroll flagged insufficient funds for the first time publicly, though Niamh had watched it approach that edge twice before in private and quietly moved money to stop it. This time she did not move money. This time it was not her responsibility. Reva's arrangement unraveled quickly once invoices became court exhibits. The Yorkville apartment had to be vacated when the lease was flagged as an improper company expense. The pearl earrings were itemized in an asset recovery order and returned in a padded document envelope. Her lawyers argued she had accepted them in good faith. The invoices did not agree. Greta lost access to Aldercroft when the lakefront cottage she had pledged in Colcroft's credit package, without disclosing that the same property carried a prior encumbrance from an earlier application, was placed under a court-supervised hold. A receiver arrived on a Thursday morning with polite manners and a stack of court orders. Greta stood at the top of the staircase and told him to leave. He showed her the paperwork. She sat down on the stairs. Opal Vries, 59-year-old housekeeper of Aldercroft House, who had worked there since before Landon inherited the property, stood near the hallway as the receiver finished his work. Beside her, Court Aldrich, 64-year-old estate and property manager of Aldercroft, folded a copy of the order into his jacket pocket and looked at Greta on the stairs with an expression that held no satisfaction and no surprise, only the particular quiet of someone who had seen this coming from a long way off. Niamh did not go to Aldercroft to watch. She learned about Greta on the stairs later and felt something quieter than vindication, more like the stillness that arrives when a long noise finally stops. She returned to Aldercroft only once, and only because the receiver required her signature to release outstanding wages owed to the household staff. She stood in the entrance hall, the same chandelier, the same table where Greta had set down her keys, the same floor where Niamh had stood with one suitcase while everyone waited for her to break, and the house looked exactly as it always had. Beautiful from the outside, expensive in ways that had never included the people who maintained it. Opal met her near the door. "We stayed as long as we could," Opal said. "Most of us are glad you helped us leave properly." Court shook her hand without saying anything, which was more than this house had managed for most of a decade. Niamh walked to the bottom of the staircase and stood there for a moment. She could almost place them where they had been that night. Landon with the envelope, Greta with the keys, Reva at the first landing with a champagne glass and borrowed earrings. Then she let the image go. It had already told her everything it needed to. Through the Page Stone Foundation, Niamh established a transition fund for Colcroft employees, the project coordinators, the accounts clerks, the site administrators who had signed timesheets for a company they had not known was carrying false numbers beneath its polished name. She worked through existing charitable channels, without press coverage, without announcement. Severance assistance, job placement support, emergency household grants for anyone who needed them. Quiet help, the way she had always helped, except this time she did not have to pretend it was someone else's idea. Marin finalized the divorce. The court recognized Landon's financial misconduct, struck the confidentiality clause he had tried to use to seal Niamh's knowledge of the company records, and set aside the lender waiver in its entirety. The settlement designed to erase her became, instead, the document that made his conduct impossible to ignore. Niamh signed the final order with her father's pen. Weeks later, she went to Page Stone Capital after closing. The building was quiet at that hour, the lobby lit low, the lake dark beyond the windows. She rode the elevator to the 14th floor alone and walked into the boardroom without turning on the overhead lights. She placed her father's pen on the table where she had signed the authorization. The same pen she had carried out of Aldercroft in the rain. The same pen she had used to write relief payments for people Landon's company could not afford to acknowledge. The same pen that had signed her name correctly, in her own hand, in the room where Landon finally understood what he had spent 9 years overlooking. She did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word for what remained once the noise cleared. She felt clear, and clarity she had learned was more durable than any revenge. Landon called once, from a number she did not recognize, 3 months after the company was dissolved. She let it go to voicemail. He said she had destroyed everything he had built. He said she had known exactly what she was doing when she walked into that boardroom. She listened once, then she deleted it. He was right, that she had known what she was doing. He had simply never understood that she had known what she was doing for 9 years before she ever walked into that room. And that every year of it, every corrected document, every covered shortfall, every call made on his behalf without being asked, had not been weakness. It had been patience. It had been a quiet woman learning the exact shape of a door, so so that when the moment came, she would know precisely how to open it. Some women are not made powerful by what is done to them. Some women were powerful all along, and the only thing the betrayal changed was who else finally knew it.